welcome to the second Firehouse Forum, and this theme this time is Irish immigration, as you already know. I have some really familiar faces in here. There's some other authors in here who I'm very proud are here. We have Barbara Walsh, who wrote August Gale, which was also about Irish immigration going to Newfoundland. I will introduce the panelists, but I do want to first of all thank First Advisors as our sponsor, the second time. We're very grateful to Larry Stone and to First Advisors. We are also during the reception, which will take place at 8:30 downstairs. We'll have wine, which was donated by Yellowfront, and we will have Irish beer, some warm, some on ice, donated by King Ayers, so that's really nice. And what else did we have? We have this wonderful group called Curlew, who are playing traditional Irish music.
Well, excuse me a moment, I need to retire.
Right.
There we go. Now I feel it. Kate said that she didn't need green to feel Irish today, so I might make her wear the
Look at all the green.
Well, there's a lot of green here.
I do want to say I feel a little bit like Charlie's Angels.
It's a role I've always wanted to play. Well, thank you for allowing me. And a special thanks to Nicole Olivier. She's been at this now for several months and organizing this, and I'm sure spending time with each one of us. So thank you for all the efforts that you put in, and for the Maine Coast Bookshop as well. I'd like to greet you all, Lá le Fáirí Conaghy, which in Irish means the day with Patrick, happiness to you, or happy St. Patrick's Day. And I have a feeling that the way that they say ye over in the British Isles, Ireland and England and Wales and Scotland, for the plural of you, I think it might have come from this. Ye and ye are so close to each other, I think. Unless you're from New York, then it's you. So anyway, okay, I feel Irish enough now. Anybody? No.
Later.
So like a Mickey Mouse.
Well, it's an honor for me to be here with such a group, and as I was thinking about the questions maybe to ask, and you'll all have golden opportunities afterwards to ask your own questions. There's just so many, I don't know sometimes where to begin. I'd like to just begin by mentioning this. And I walked in and I was so shocked to see this, because this is Inistioge. And any of you who might know Ireland, this is in the southeast of Ireland. It's a small little rural town, but it has, it's close to the coast, it's on a river, and it has a special connection, and that's probably why you chose it, to this area, especially Damascata Mills, Newcastle. Many of the people who first settled this area and set up mills here, the Kavanagh families, the Cottrells, they both came from this area. And in my neighborhood of Munjoy Hill in Portland, we have an Irish historian from Stonehill living there, and his wife Fidelma, and her children were all born in Inistioge. And they are now writing a major work on Inistioge, which will be of special import to this area when that comes out. So welcome to Balsharoe. It's good to have all of you here. I thought that I'd start out because it is St. Patrick's Day, and there's so many Irish themes connected with works that you've done and the thoughts that you had. A little quote from Yeats: "Out of Ireland we have come, great hatred, little room, marred us from the start. We carried from our mother's womb a fanatic heart." So with that as sort of an introduction, I'd like to ask you all just to comment on the Irishness of your work and how Ireland or Irish themes or Irish individuals have influenced you and continue to influence you. Maybe we'll go from that side to this side, or if you want to go in any special order.
First,
let me say thank you all so much for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see such a big, warm, full room, and I'm delighted to be here. My work, I think of myself as an environmental writer, and I'm really interested in the relationship that people form with place and landscape, and I think that's something that permeates all of my work. And when I first learned about the Jeannie Johnston, which is the famine ship, here, I really started to think about, what was it to be on the ship, and what does the ship have to say about these relationships that we form? And for me, someone who wrote this book about the Irish famine, I became really interested in this idea of land and the ties that we form to land. And some of the issues that are inherent in there. Issues that span things like agriculture. As many of you know, the reason that the famine occurred was because Ireland was in the process of, under British colonial rule, experimenting with the very first project of industrial agriculture, what we call monocropism, which is very much what America uses today if you look at the corn and the soybean fields of the Midwest. And it was because of that monocropism that the potato failed so catastrophically. And the idea of leaving a landscape that and by and large, most of the famine immigrants were being sent to British North America, what we now know as Canada, as part of a governmental project to work the land there. The British government wanted people up in the Ottawa Timber Valley, felling the trees, starting agriculture up there as well. Most of the immigrants had no desire whatsoever to be under the crown, and so they wanted very much to be in places like Maine, and they would travel here too. So for me, it's very much a question of land and the way in which we form identities, cultural identities, and also personal identities based on landscape. And I think Ireland is a great example of that. I think there are a lot of really wonderful ties between the geography of Ireland and Maine, and also the culture that the two share as well. And so those became really interesting projects to me as I was thinking about my own identity and also the identities that we form here in Maine.
Thank you. Grindstone is, I'm going to answer in a roundabout way, but Grindstone is an island in the Thousand Islands just south of Ontario, Lake Ontario, on the St. Lawrence River, which borders the States and Canada. And it actually grew from a well-documented Confederate conspiracy to overthrow the North. It was built toward the ends of the war. And so it started out as a thriller, a spy thriller. But as I began to write, I began to think a lot more. It became much more important to me to think about the people that had settled that region. And it happened that I'd gone to Ireland a couple of times in the course of writing the novel. And when I was in Ireland, I knew about the famine, and I listened to Irish music for such a long time, but when I was there, it began to resonate in a very different way. So I would say that the true novel probably started with Paddy's Lamentation and Green Fields of America, which is, you probably heard the Chieftain's version of it, De Donna. But in any case, the story became, the heart of the novel is really the voice of a young woman who settled in Grindstone, trying to make a living, trying to make a go of it. She's there by herself. Her brother has gone for a soldier. He joined the Union because there was no other way for an Irishman to make money, and he was paid $300 to stand for somebody else. But if you know the Thousand Islands, it's probably a lot like the Gold Coast of Maine. It's people, it's the heyday of the Thousand Islands was in the Gilded Era, the 1880s, when it became the center of huge resorts for people. And when you go there now, there are a lot of houses, giant houses, mansions on the islands, and a lot of big boats. It's famous for the beautiful wooden boats, antique boats. But I started thinking a lot more about who was there first, who settled there, on whose shoulders are we standing. And so it became a very different novel.
My novel is called Orphan Train. Between 1854 and 1929, over 75 years, more than 200,000 children, as many as 250,000 children, were sent from the East Coast, ports on the East Coast, mostly New York, mostly, in fact, out of Grand Central, to the Midwest in a labor program. They were, as Nicole said, it was called an orphan train. They were called orphan trains, but actually only 30% of them, roughly, were orphan children. The others were abandoned. They were taken out of homes, they were runaways, and they were picked up off the streets. And a large number of them were Irish. We don't have exact numbers because the record keeping was so terrible that we don't even know how many there were. But the Irish were particularly vulnerable for a number of reasons. In 1854, as you know, the potato famine, all of that. I don't know if any of you have read Colm Toibin's novel Brooklyn, but and I'm sure if many of you know much about Irish history, you already know this, but he writes about this quite eloquently, and I write about it in the book as well, which is that oftentimes in Ireland, villages could only afford to scrape together enough money to send 1 or 2 people over at a time. Unlike, say, large Italian families or Jewish families that would set up enclaves in New York and outlying areas. And so if something happened to one of those 1 or 2 adults, a child would be really vulnerable and have no one. And also, villages in Ireland who sent people over often didn't even anticipate or expect that they would have communication after that. The communication was complicated, so they would lose track of the people who would come over. And then the Irish would come to New York and be hit with a tidal wave of hatred that they were not anticipating. On top of having survived the famine and all the other indignities of life under the British thumb, they came to America and were treated terribly, as I'm sure you know. And what that meant was that it was very difficult to get a job, very difficult to hold a job. There were no social programs of any kind, no welfare, no child labor laws, no child welfare laws, nothing protecting poor people, very little social mobility. So the children were really quite vulnerable. And Charles Loring Brace, a Methodist minister, came up with this idea. And in some ways it was a positive idea in that he saw that there were 30,000 children living on the streets of New York at any given time during this period. And they were starving, they were being run over, they were going to jail, they were becoming prostitutes, they were dying of disease. Nothing good was happening with those poor children on the streets of New York. And he imagined a kind of fresh air fund. At the same time, though, it was a work program. It was a labor program. There was never any question. Children were property, poor children, pure and simple, were labor. And furthermore, the final thing I'll say is that he was a Methodist minister, and there was an evangelical bent to his idea, which was he wanted to take these heathen children, Jewish, Catholic, non-practicing, and put them into good, solid, Protestant, preferably Methodist homes in the Midwest. And eventually, as the program got bigger and bigger, and these several hundred thousands of children went, they ran out of Methodist homes, as you might imagine. And the Foundling Hospital, which was Catholic, got involved, and so all of that changed, but that was the original impulse. So that's the sort of origin story of my novel.
People with the best of intentions start things that don't really work out that way.
Yes.
Thinking of the Quakers with the penitentiary movement, you know, so I think things like that happen quite often.
Yeah.
By the way, congratulations. I don't know how long it's been #1, but looking at the New York Times yesterday, your book is #1 on the trade paperback list, so congratulations.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Everybody loves the Irish.
A neighbor of mine on Munjoy Hill was mentioning when he knew I was coming up to this that he's from Nebraska, and he knows, and he grew up with many of the families that had come out on these orphan trains. Just staying on a similar topic, I know that this will affect you, Kate. Where did you do the research for your books? And you know, I know you have a strong connection with Blennerville. I worked in Tralee for 2 summers, and the run that I used to do every morning took me from Tralee to Blennerville, so I walked right by the place where the Jeannie Johnson was reconstructed. So where did you all do your research, and how?
Well, there is a recreation of the Jeannie Johnston. The Jeannie Johnston was one of 5,000 famine ships. They were called coffin ships because they had mortality rates that in some cases exceeded 70%, which made them worse than slave ships in terms of their survival rates. And of these 5,000 ships, the Jeannie Johnston distinguished itself for being the only famine ship that never lost a passenger. In fact, it gained a passenger on the very first trip. A baby boy was born on Easter Sunday. And so because of this incredible feat, this sort of miraculous feat, after the peace accords took effect in the late 90s, and there was this resurgence of interest in sort of finding cultural ways to combine the Republic of Ireland with Northern Ireland, they settled on a project to recreate the ship. And so there is, in fact, a recreation of the ship. It's currently docked in Dublin. It was built in a small town called Blunnerville, which is out in the southwest. And so I first became familiar with the project because of the recreation. And that was really where my interest first lay. So I had the good fortune to sail as apprentice crew on the ship one summer, which was great fun. And then the rest of my research really was divided between Ireland itself. But Ireland, of course, was not a country at this time. It was a colony of England. And so a lot of my research took me to London, to the National Archives in Kew, to Quebec. As I mentioned earlier, quite deliberately, the British government wanted very much for these Irish immigrants to be in British North America, one of their largest colonial holdings at the time. The U.S. archives as well. So this sort of triangle that I was doing, that was really kind of interesting because it was sort of recreating the triangle that the Irish immigrants themselves were making.
If you're embarking on historical fiction, you're probably a fool to set out with a topic like the American Civil War or Irish immigration. It is territory that's so heavily trod that it's mind-boggling that I even started that particular topic. But I'm lucky that my husband, David, who's here, is a Civil War historian, so I could rely on him for the big pieces. And so forth. But the details about the Confederate spying I unearthed by simply looking at old newspaper clippings. There's a great book by John Headley called Confederate Operations in Northern New York and Canada that really was the key to opening the door. And of course, lots and lots of information about Irish soldiers coming in, or Irish immigrants coming in to become soldiers. So it was a huge number of areas to touch upon, and so it meant a lot of research.
I heard a theory one time that the term gringo came from the Irish soldiers that were in Mexico, and they were singing songs such as "Green Grow the Rushes."
That's great.
And they associated that with all the Anglo soldiers, but they wouldn't have known the difference between an English and an Irish.
That's amazing. I love that.
We don't put it down as history, but it's a good
That's the kind of history. Yeah, so we've all done a lot of research. I mean, I am, just the Irish portion of this is that I settled on the village of Kinvara, which is south of Galway by 10 miles, because at the time I'm writing about, they sent the largest number of immigrants to America. And I went to Kinvara and Galway and all over that area. And a woman, I'll just tell this story because I find it so wonderful, a woman in the village was showing me around, and we were in the center of the village, which is cobblestone, you know, a butcher and baker and a candlestick maker. And it was called Phantom Street. The street name was Phantom Street. And I said, why would it be called that? And she said, well, Kinvara is built over a medieval graveyard. And I said, that is a little creepy to me. And she said, well, we don't think it is at all. We think that we're living with our history, that our ancestors are always with us, and that their spirits rise up through our souls. And I thought that was so beautiful. It's actually in the book. I have it in the novel. But for a while, my novel was called Phantom Street, because, and as I'll read you eventually just a couple of paragraphs, this is my prologue, but the novel is really about the ghosts of our past and how we live and come to terms with our pasts. And so that was particularly resonant for me.
She's also showing her intelligence by picking what probably the most beautiful coastal town in all of Ireland.
It really is.
And it's very close to Galway, so you can get there in no time, but it has incredible traditional music.
I'd love
Jackie
to live
Daly,
there.
the accordion
Yes.
player,
Yeah.
comes from that area.
Yes.
It's just, so if you're going to do research, you might as well pick a nice
Well, and when I was walking around the town, and I have a slideshow that I do, and I show people a picture of this gorgeous town, people gasp because all the buildings are different colors. It's gorgeous, it's beautiful. And I said, as I was walking around with her, how could all these people, why would they all leave this beautiful town? And she said, you have no idea how destitute we were. People were starving to death. And I have a history of this beautiful book, A History of the Town, and you can see the pictures of what it was like and how incredibly cut off they were and unable to get anything, any money, any jobs.
There was a tremendous connection between Kinvara and Connemara, where my people come from, because there were little ships that would go, cart boats that would go over and bring turf over. You see, because there was more turf over in Galway, where they cut
The
turf
bogs.
for the bogs.
Yeah.
And it was more hilly, and the Burren is very close to Kinvara.
The Burren is so beautiful. If you go to Galway, you must go to the Burren and the Cliffs of Moher, of course, but because they're just stunning and unforgettable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this next question is one that Nicole wanted to ask, but I wanted to ask as well. How do you choose your genre for writing? I mean, is there such a thing as pure history, or is that an oxymoron? What's the difference between a historical novel and a novel? What's the strengths and weaknesses of each? Do you want to start?
You want to start?
We'll go the
You
opposite
want me
way.
to start?
Yeah.
Now, you asked a lot of questions, but
Yeah.
let me see here. So I wrote a novel because when I started the book 3 years ago, there were 150 living train riders, all between 90 and 100 years old. There are now fewer than 20, and I interviewed 7 of them. And I read over 300 first-person narratives. There's this incredible archive called the National Orphan Train Complex, which is in Concordia, Kansas. And they have a kind of Shoah project for train rider stories. So they're first-person oral histories. They're oral histories. And I read lots of books. And believe it or not, this story, which I would imagine not many of you know that much about, at least that's usual with my audiences, this story has been sort of hidden in plain sight. If you go to Amazon, the dreaded Amazon, and type in orphan train, you'll see that there are at least 20 books with exactly, not only the same topic, but the same title as my book, actually. So it's a story that people have known about in some way. But what I found, and I'll try to be really quick about this, but what I found as I interviewed people, and as I read the stories, is that after a while, I realized that they had the same character arc, and I came to think of it as a narrative of redemption, which is this. Something terrible happened to me, in New York usually. I was put on a train. I got to the Midwest, and I had a rocky transition. Most train riders, for many reasons, had a difficult time. They went into small conservative communities, generally, that were very hard to break into. But eventually, say in my 20s, I found my footing, and those same small conservative communities that were difficult to integrate actually became comfortable to live in when you'd gone through so much turmoil and trauma. The vast majority of train riders not only never left the states they were put into, but never left the very small communities or even farmlands that they were on. In their 20s, I found my footing. Maybe I got married. I perhaps went to school. I got a job. I had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And now I'm 90 years old. I'm 95 years old, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. God intended it. It was fated. It was meant to be. I'm so glad that this happened to me because I would never have had this beautiful family in this beautiful place, right, if I hadn't. And of course, that's the story we all tell about our lives. We all turn our lives into narratives in which eventually good comes out of whatever it was, and that makes perfect sense, and those stories are true. But I wanted to tell a different story. I wanted to dwell in the stories of the train riders, which most train rider narratives don't do. And I wanted not to be compelled to tell a happy ending. So this is a long way of saying that's why I wrote a novel and not nonfiction.
I think you write narrative fiction, or narrative history, very well. And when I was reading yours, I was thinking about why you would make that choice. I mean, good narrative history is a wonder. And having grown up with terribly written histories, I especially appreciate the ability to do that and to bring it to life. In my case, I'm not a historian, I'm a writer, and there were so many pieces to pull together that the only way I could possibly conceive of it would be in historical fiction. It's a complicated story, and for me, it's getting at the heart of the matter. It's the story that multiple characters tell, pulling the experiences together. So for me, I'm also a teacher, and one of the things that I worried about a lot was that being a teacher and a mother, my instinct is to make everything nice, to have happy endings, and I worried for a long time that it would be fatal to my skills as a writer. And I wrote a novel early on, quite a number of years ago, that was picked up by Little Brown, and it was a young adult novel written for my daughters, essentially, who were 11 at the time. And when I look back on it now, it has all the worst instincts. It is making everything nice, having a happy ending. I wanted to protect my children and my characters. But when I came to Grindstone, I realized that being a teacher was not a bad thing. I had to figure out how to turn that profession into, turn my profession, which I valued all these years, into something that would help my writing. And so, well, the novel isn't didactic. It's still, I realized that as a storyteller, I could let people know, I could tell the story of something that a lot of people didn't know about. Very few people know about the conspiracy. Very few people understand the day-to-day life in those very well, but have become very wealthy communities. It's lost. So for me, that was the best vehicle for doing so.
That was quite a compliment, she gave you.
I know.
It's an incredible quote, I think, really. I don't know if there's going to be some other great quotes that come out of it, but good narrative history is a wonder.
Yeah.
I think is a wonderful quote.
Wonderment.
A wonderment. Editor as well.
I wish I could write fiction. I wish I had the talent to write fiction, and I don't. My background, actually, I have a PhD, which gets used very rarely these days. And I can remember one day when I was fairly new to Maine, I was at Colby doing some research for a scholarly article I was writing, and I found some anthology that had an essay in it that I had written on some incredibly esoteric thing. And a student had underlined it in places. And I thought, oh my God, somebody read it. And then I thought, wait a minute, this is the wrong approach. And so I started doing more, I guess what you could call sort of popular work. And again, as an environmental writer, I think that that's really important. You know, we're a planet in peril, not to put too fine a point on it. And so for me, the question is knowing that and knowing the urgency that I feel like we have in terms of getting people to think about the choices they make and the relationships they make. How is the best way I can do that? And I decided that for me personally, making a shift from more scholarly work to popular work was the way to do it. There was a really wonderful study that was done a few years ago. A group of psychologists went into assisted living centers and were working with people who had severe late-stage Alzheimer's and dementia. And these were people who no longer recognized children or spouses. But they went in and they would take these 8 by 10 pictures of things, a balloon and a boy and a wagon and a building. And the people in the center, these late-stage Alzheimer's and dementia patients, could still construct stories about these pictures. And the psychologists, in their study, they said, look, narrative is one of the first things we come to cognitively in our development. And based on our study, we're prepared to say narrative is the very last thing we lose, even after we've lost the ability to recognize the most precious people in our lives. And that really resonates with me. These stories that we tell, the stories that define us as individuals and define us as cultures. And for me, when it comes to the Irish famine and the subsequent exodus, it's very much an Irish story, but I would like to make the case that it's very much an American story. The thing that defines our culture is that we're a nation of immigrants. And maybe your people didn't come from Ireland, but there's over a 95% chance that your people came on a boat, And I think that that's where we have this commonality, and we can approach one another and say, we have this experience, this is part of our identity. And so for me, that was an incredibly exciting opportunity to say, look at this place where we can come together and say, this is what it is to be an American.
Jesse Jackson used to have a famous line that went something like, maybe we didn't all come over on the same ship, but we're in the same boat. Quiz time. So, yes, I popped this on everybody, but I think that you'll all enjoy to hear a little reading from each of them. And so they've each chosen a little piece that they'd like to do, and maybe at some point they'll say why they chose that from their entire work. In the order.
You haven't gotten the first yet for anything.
That's my nature. Mine is the prologue to my novel, and it is 3 pages. I hope that's not going to be, I'm going to overstay my welcome. Yes? No? No. And I will tell you that the novel is written from 2 different perspectives in the third person, one from the perspective of the Confederate spy and the other from the Irish girl. The prologue and the epilogue are in first person, so it's a departure. Every Monday, oh good Lord, okay. Every morning but Sunday, I watched them depart, Ben and my father heading off to the schoolhouse, my long-legged brother matching strides with our dog. By then, our father had lost all of his faith and much of his hope. Mostly charity remained as he taught without pay the few lads left to learn. And discipline, his belief that routine gives shape and therefore meaning to the day. For logic, one studied Latin. For truth, the Greeks. It urged me that they should leave me behind, for I thought myself twice as clever as my twin. So when Finn returned at tea, I made much of the time spent with my mother, of our mornings exploring the shore in search of kelpies and mussels, climbing up to the ferry ring that overlooked Tawny Bay. During the day, the ring was safe enough, for the ferries only did their mischief at night. We sat in the sun high above the sea, watching the shadows of the clouds on the hillside, my mother's hand on my own as she helped me to shape my letters. Her hands were rough, for as a girl she mended the fishing nets along with her mother. Her years as a wife had not softened them, although she had married the Scottish landlord's son and could have had help. Nor had they softened her temper, as sharp and quick as her laughter. When I open the door to memory, I hear her voice reciting the old verses, the one that proclaim our glory days. It was she who chose our names for their power and wisdom. Finn, the great hero of Irish myth. Anya, queen of the fairies. My father had indulged his pretty wife in this fancy, but the name soon became a source of pain for him, for their terrible irony. On Gortamore, the great hunger, 1 million dead, millions more leaving Ireland, on ships rife with typhus and cholera. The English, who had starved us, observed that with so many departed, a man could now have a decent portion of land to support his children. They have no shame, no decency. We are not better off. My father shook the cottage with his anger. He tore through the newsprint until he found the quotation. Here, read what the German Marx has written. After being starved into ruin, the Irish are good only for whoring and begging. By then, the rift between my father and his own family was complete. His father and mother returned to Scotland, the plantation manor left in the hands of the British overseer. I understood even as a child that my mother filled my days with heroes and fairies to replace the faith my father had lost. She did not know how many hours Finn and I spent exploring the empty cottages that had once held our playmates. Some had been buried near the kitchen gardens because the churchyards were overcrowded, their unsanctified graves piled high with stones to keep the animals away. Like so many others, Father began to look to America for salvation. He was convinced of its bounty. There a man could raise his children to believe in the possibility of dignity, of dreams. Our mother was adamant that we remain in Ireland. Although the days of the coffin ships had passed, the journey was still dangerous, the city's brutal. Those who survived arrived desperate and ill, welcomed only by kin. She would not leave her home for such an uncertain future. In the end, it was no dream of bounty that carried us to America. As Finn grew older, Father came to recognize in his son his own idealism, corroded with a hatred of everything English. It seemed inevitable that were he to remain in Ireland, Finn would join one of the secret brotherhoods, ending up in prison or dead. So our father cast our fates to the winds that would carry us across the Atlantic. 10 weeks the voyage took, and as fate would have it, Finn and I were left to survive on our own. Our mother had died before we stepped aboard the Marguerite, our father in Kingston, Ontario, in the aftermath of the terrible journey. I was 20 when the story begins, living in the state of New York on a rough granite island named Grindstone, just below the headwaters of the St. Lawrence River. By then, Finn had gone for a soldier, and I was alone. In the atlas, Grindstone looked like a country unto itself, surrounded by 100 lesser islands, inhabited, I was certain, with bears and wild men. When I came to that place, it was October, and the trees were red and gold. Then November came, with its somber skies. December.
Life in the St. Andrews Railroad shantytown soon proved anything but stable. The house, and this is John Gaynor, he's one of the immigrants, the house John Gaynor was given was as hastily constructed as any other in the railroad districts across North America. The cold Canadian wind whipped through the clapboards. Heat, Gaynor soon learned, was not included in his room and board. Neither was bedding nor food and clothing for the kids. Work, too, was in short supply. The brutal winter that year made progress on the railroad difficult. Further complicating matters was a lawsuit over where the tracks would run. With a surfeit of employees, the railroad company had no qualms about establishing restrictions for those who wanted to earn a paycheck. Immigrants who did not speak English were too much bother. Those who were aging or sick were ineffective. A single father was a liability. What did Gaynor intend to do if one of his sons needed him? Drop everything and race home? Each time he reported for work, Gaynor found that he wasn't needed that day. Neither, it seemed, was anyone else who had sailed with him aboard the Jeannie Johnston. Christmas came and went. Gaynor began skipping meals so that his sons could eat. He grew gaunt and weak. The lack of heat continued to take its toll on his children. The winter refused to relent. By February, the situation had become life-threatening. As a blizzard squalled through the region, the Gaynors, along with the other Jeannie passengers, convened for an emergency meeting. They would die if they remained in the railroad camp. The only person they knew could help was Thomas Jones, the customs official who would help them to secure the jobs in the first place. St. Andrews was 20 miles away, and the snowstorm was growing more fierce by the minute. Even so, 30 of the passengers donned every article of clothing they owned and set out. They arrived at Jones's home well after midnight. Later, he would admit he thought their desperate knocking was a loose shutter rapping in the storm. Surely no human would be out in such weather. But the pounding continued, and so donning his robe, Jones went to investigate. He opened his front door to a blast of cold air and over 24 wretchedly clad Irish immigrants, all starving and suffering from exposure. Jones was a British civil servant well-schooled in Whig policies, and assisting immigrants was clearly not one of those policies. He resisted the pleas of those wet and hungry refugees for as long as he could, but then humanity interceded and he allowed them inside. They were a miserable group A man named Doyle had made the walk with a serious injury sustained on the railroad. Jones couldn't fathom how he had managed to survive the trek. The same was true for a man named Sullivan, whose hypothermia now appeared life-threatening. They were both sent immediately to a hospital. So too were John Gaynor's sons, both of whom were gravely ill and suffering from severe frostbite. So severe, in fact, that Jones doubted whether their feet could be saved. Somehow they survived and even kept their feet. But despite Jones's pleas and grave assessment of the situation, his supervisor in St. John's refused to lend assistance. The railroad contractors, who Jones saw as the real culprits, could not be bothered either. And so Thomas Jones learned the same truth Daniel Riley had learned in Liberty. The constructing of this railroad, he wrote, will never benefit the Irish immigrant. It seemed there was nothing he could do. While John Gaynor remained to watch over his sons and the other immigrants who went to the hospital, those well enough to continue on determined to do just that. Penniless and without proper clothing, they left St. Andrews that February on foot, following the Maine coast for 250 miles before arriving in Portland. They were exhausted, cold, and very hungry, but they were alive.
They're the ones who haunt us, the ones who have left us behind. Many times in my life, I have felt them around me, observing, witnessing, when no one in the living world knew or cared what happened. I am 91 years old, and almost everyone who was once in my life is now a ghost. Sometimes these spirits have been more real to me than people, more real than God. They fill silence with their weight, dense and warm, like bread dough rising under cloth. My Gram, with her kind eyes and talcum-dusted skin. My Da, sober, laughing. My Man, singing a tune. The bitterness and alcohol and depression are stripped away from these phantom incarnations, and they console and protect me in death as they never did in life. I've come to think that's what heaven is, a place in the memory of others where our best selves live on. Maybe I'm lucky that at the age of 9, I was given the ghosts of my parents' best selves, and at 23, the ghost of my true love's best self, and my sister, Maisie, ever present, an angel on my shoulder. 18 months to my 9 years, 13 years to my 20. Now she is 84 to my 91, and with me still. No substitute for the living, perhaps, but I wasn't given a choice. I could take solace in their presence, or I could fall down in a heap, lamenting what I'd lost. The ghost whispered to me, telling me to go on.
I think I have time maybe for one more question, and then we'll take a little break and then come back, reassemble for questions from the audience. So my question to you all is, the first impression that any type of a book makes is the appearance of the book. And these books are beautiful. I would say that if I had to describe all of them together, hauntingly beautiful. So could you each explain how the book came to look the way that it did?
Well, my book looked completely different up until the 11th hour. And I got an email from an independent bookseller here in Maine. And he sent me an email, and I had done a reading for my first book there, and I hadn't talked to him since. And he said, "It's not the worst cover I've ever seen." He said, "And P.S. I'm sending this to Simon & Schuster as well." And I called my agent, who some of you probably know. She lives here in Damariscotta. And I said, I don't really like the cover either. And she said, well, let me pull it up on Amazon. And she said, oh my God, it's terrible. And so she called the editor, and we had a fairly impassioned conversation. And what I kept saying was, I want a cover that I feel proud to hold. And the sad truth, and maybe your experiences have been different, but my experience, which was sort of a shock to me as a young writer, was that really you have no choice whatsoever in what your book looks like, or frankly what it's called. But luckily, you know, we sort of persuaded the editor that the cover really didn't get to the heart of the story. And for me, the story, you know, is as much a biography of this beautiful ship as anything else. And so the editor was willing, even after it had already been in the catalog, it was already up everywhere, the editor was willing to consider other options. And so this was actually taken by an amateur photographer who belongs to a yacht club in Cork, Ireland. And the Jeannie Johnston was anchored there, and he went out one day in his boat and took a picture of it. And I thought it was the most stunning, haunting thing I had ever seen, and luckily he gave us permission to use it. So that's my story.
Great.
And I had a similar experience when my first book came out with Little Brown, and I had no say over the cover, which horrified me, or the title. So when Grindstone emerged, I contacted Ian Correstein, who's a famous photographer, world famous photographer of the Thousand Islands, and I asked him if I could lease one of his photos for the cover. I love the cover. I love the cover. He was great. I sent him some chapters. He loved the novel and said, "I will do whatever I can to help you," and he did. It was an amazing experience. So I ended up with a cover that I thought captured everything that I wanted my novel to be. So that's my story.
And just quickly, we went through about 20 covers. It was hard to come up with one, and when I do this slideshow, I show pictures of some of the other covers because it's fascinating to me, but maybe also to other people to see the evolution of an idea and how you sort of come up with it. I work really collaboratively with my publisher. I do have a say over the cover, but I've been working with them for a long time. And so it was never right. It just wasn't ever right. A book like this with one narrator begins at 9 years old and the other character is 17 could look like a young adult book and be sort of have that kind of, one of the covers looks like a Laura Ingalls Wilder cover essentially. And it was hard to get the idea right. In the end, the art director at HarperCollins put together 3 images: a train door, a landscape, and this girl, and combined all of them, and then part of it's glossy and part of it's shiny, metallic. And what I like about it is that the character, this girl, is both reflecting and she's reflected. And it feels like there's something metaphorical and literal happening in the cover, and it also just feels nice, so I was happy.
Thank you all very much. I think we've reached 8 o'clock, so you had suggested 10 minutes. Could we make it 5? Because I'm sure there's a lot of questions. Would that be okay?
Michael, and for the whole panel,
Yeah, I know it's talking
Yes.
about.
you used a phrase something like, the Irish were treated terribly. Why? Why were the Irish treated terribly?
I'll take that one. The Irish were really the first group to come over to America who were, other than slaves, who were non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. They were white, although there's a lot of books written about that topic too, how the Irish became white, etc. Because they were often compared with slaves. They loved their music, they were happy-go-lucky, they raised large families, those kind of stereotypes. Probably the biggest difference was the religion, and back then Roman Catholicism was seen as a threat to the democratic ideals of America, somebody taking lessons or instructions from a foreign potentate, whether his name was Francis or Benedict or whatever.
Also, the Irish came over, as you've written so well, in the coffin ships, which were rife with disease, and so villages were terrified of this influx of people carrying disease, and so they did everything possible to keep them out.
The Irish were discriminated against terribly, but redheads had it worst of all. And for a while, redheads were banned from the orphan trains because they were so loathed, feared, and despised that they would get on the train in New York and 30 kids would make the route all the way up the Midwest, dropping kids off all along the way, and the train would come back and there'd be 3 redheads sitting there. And there's an article that I have in my slideshow from the New York Times, 1905, talking about why why redheads were so unwanted, that they were seen as demon children, that their tempers were terrible, that they were terribly behaved, that they were devil spawn, all of it. Yeah, pretty incredible.
Right on.
I have two redheads, so I was particularly interested in that. And my character's a redhead. As a result of that, all that research, I really wanted to show what it felt like to be a child treated that way.
It's interesting, down the coast of Bath a little bit, back in the early 1800s, there was a congregational meeting house church in the south end of High Street that was burned around the 1820s by a group called the Know-Nothings. And the church, it was a congregational church, had been leased to Irish, Italians, basically the Roman Catholic community in that area at the time, and they were burned out.
My first book has an image of the church as it was, and then going up in flames. And the thing that is so interesting about that is that it was a Protestant church, but it was being used for ulterior purposes. So that was enough. If you don't mind, I'll tell another quick story about St. Patrick's Church. A little bit after the Know-Nothings, there was talk of a group of people in this area who were going to get together and do the same thing to that church. And they tried to recruit a local man because he was known to be a Protestant, and they thought he would go along with them. Well, he would not go along with them, and he told one of his Roman Catholic friends about the plan. So the priest up at St. Patrick's had a cordon around the church, and it was protected that way. The daughter of that man just died a few years ago at the age of 106 years old. And that story actually is up there at the church. They have some of the archives there, and you can read that story. It's an amazing story.
I never heard of things about the famine, and I'm third generation Irish. And is it true that most of those who did come over never mentioned it because they didn't want to remember it? Well, I've checked with cousins and they know nothing.
In Portland, there were...
Massachusetts.
Oh yes. Yeah. In Portland, there were quite a few Irish that came over at the time of the famine, but the largest number came over the next generation. There were more than one famine in Ireland. There were several. They were ongoing. And the second worst famine was 1879 to 1891. Did I say that right?
And the worst one was 1845 to 1848. Is that right?
The worst one was that one. Yes, exactly. That was called the Great Famine, or the Great Hunger, as they say in Ireland.
Because, I read the book recently, and that's a horrible, horrible story.
My father used to tell the story of, then I put this in my my fledgling novel, Potato and Point, and it was the meal that they liked to eat, but they could only afford meat once every week, so they would buy the meat, hang it, and then boil the potatoes and point it at the meat, and that is that yours?
Crazy.
It's ironic to me that the potatoes that were, that had this awful blight was the only vegetable, the only actual real food that the Irish were able to keep in their own country, but they were farming for the British, and all of the food that they were growing was shipped to England. And so when this blight happened, I can't remember the name, you've mentioned the name, but at any rate, they were begging for food, and the British government was adamant that they did not want to support people who were looking for handouts. They didn't want them to, they thought, well, if we help them, if we give them this charity, then they won't work.
Right.
And so they just kept on starving and starving, and it's shameful.
There's a very good editorial
In the New York Times.
Yeah.
Yes, I put a quote.
But it's also,
here
you hear so
of
many
it.
times that the Irish are too stupid to grow anything else on a potato, but they didn't even own their own fish. It was desperate.
It's terrible.
Was that the editorial that mentioned Charles
Yes,
Trevelyan?
yes.
Yeah, my
Yes.
sister was taken by that. She was really taken by
I
that.
put that in this brochure, in the flyer.
We're talking about an editorial in the New York Times a couple of days ago by Timothy Egan, who wrote his latest novel, National Book Award winning nonfiction book, is about the Dust Bowl. And he wrote about the Irish in this amazing piece a couple of days ago.
There's a famous song over there called The Fields of Athenry, and one of the lines you might know, for he stole Trevelyan's corn. Trevelyan was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Treasury Department, that his child might see the morn. Now something ship lies sailing in the bay, so he was deported, to Australia for that offense.
The thing about this potato, too, is this is not the potato that you buy at Hannaford right now. This is a potato called the lumper, and it was a nearly perfect food. It was low in vitamin D, and it obviously didn't have protein. But other than that, it had all the amino acids. It was a perfect food, and if you could supplement it with a glass of buttermilk now and again, you would live a monotonous but an incredibly healthful life. And prior to the famine, Irish people were significantly taller than their British counterparts. They had better teeth, they had lower infant mortality, they had higher lifespans. It's a remarkable thing that has happened, that happened here as well. So when you hear the potato, and admittedly it would be a terrible diet, but this was an incredibly healthful, way of living too.
Well, what happened to that potato?
Yes.
Well, so the potato came from South America, was introduced largely as ground cover in Ireland initially, and then, became food. Interestingly enough, I think fascinating, the blight, Phytothoria infestans, don't ask me to spell it, also came from South America. And it came by way of the United States. And we were embarking upon new agricultural policies, and we had very nutrient poor soil in places like Maine, but up and down the eastern seaboard. And so to solve that problem, we began importing seabird guano from South America to the eastern seaboard to enrich our soil, and the blight came in that guano. And then in the same ships that we were using in this triangle trade that ultimately fueled the famine immigration, we brought the blight over to Ireland, and so it all but eradicated this. Potatoes reproduce by way of they clone themselves. It's not actually a sexual reproduction. And so the lumper was all but destroyed, but a scientist over in England now is bringing it back.
Wow.
Well, whoever can be on top of that.
I have read all 3 of your books, and I truly enjoyed each and every one of them. So thank you for being here. Thank you for writing them. When I read, because I read a lot, but part of what I like to read is what I call fictional nonfiction, which is what you were describing as historical narrative. And I particularly enjoy that because I always learn something. And I feel like I learn it because the way it's written makes it interesting. So you learn history, or you learn people, or you learn phrases. Like I know phrases from each of your books that were particularly memorable. And I wonder, in this age where we have so much technology and televisions and games and computers, it seems like books could be competing with other things like that. And I would hope that narratives like yours continue to be alive and be written, because they fill a very special place for a lot of people.
I was on a plane. I've been on a few planes recently, and I've been looking around. I don't see many hardcovers, but I do see a lot of books, and adults are reading books, certainly on planes, and e-readers, but with books on them, not games. And I'm perhaps ridiculously optimistic about it, but I find that people are reading, that they're not reading at all. In fact, in publishing right now, in New York, publishing mainstream, I guess that sort of gatekeeper world of those big publishers, for a while, literary fiction was really on the wane and they weren't buying it. And for example, my agent wasn't taking on novelists, and they're buying them again, and they're selling like crazy, and there are a lot of literary novels, many of which have a historical component. So there's sort of this resurgence, at least in that way, that I've seen.
I also see the potential in expanding the medium. The photographer who did this cover, when he helped me, it became clear that he was working on his autobiography, his memoir, and I offered to help him. And so together we took probably a 300,000 word manuscript, the slash and burn, tough love technique of editing and rewriting. But another group took an interest in it, and that is a company in Toronto that created an iPad app ebook, so that ultimately the book 1 in 1,000 is an app that contains about 450 photographs and embedded video and music, and it was thrilling to be a part of that venture. It was I realized the potential, and while I certainly love sitting down and reading a novel, I also realized that it can go in a lot of directions, has a lot of potential.
Have time for maybe one more question? Maybe I'll ask the question. What are ye working on these days?
I have a manuscript due on Friday, and it's about Hurricane Sandy, and it'll be out in 2015.
And it's about what?
Hurricane Sandy.
Oh.
Another light and jovial topic.
And focusing on the bounty?
Not so much anymore, but the bounty plays a role.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm working on a prequel to Grindstone. I was hired to do an audio script for whatever, and it was based on an episode of piracy in 1,000 Islands in the rebellions, not the word, the rebellions, and it was so fascinating that I realized that was the next story to tell.
Well, I am staying with Susan and Barnaby, wherever they are, and I'm sleeping in the guest room under the poster of an exhibit called Wondrous Strange that was at the Farnsworth in 1998-99, I believe, which I actually didn't see, but that book has become one of my favorite books because I'm writing a novel inspired by the painting Kristina's World. And it's from the perspective of Kristina herself, so I've read just about everything that I could get my hands on. And Wyeth's journey and his family history is also very interesting to me.
Well, this has been a thrill for me. And is there one more question?
Just one quick question.
Yeah.
It's obvious that you all thoroughly enjoy the research that you do in writing the novels. You enjoy writing the novels as much as you enjoy doing the research?
Absolutely.
No.
It's hard every day. It's hard every day. And even when it's going well, you think, it's going to stop going well. It's very neurotic, maybe. It's very hard.
It can be so hard to find the words. You sit and you look, and my partner's here, and he knows. I'm just like, I'll come back in. I'll be like, I don't know where are the words.
I don't have any words.
There's a great story about James Joyce that I tell all the time. That a friend of his, it's St. Patrick's Day. A friend walked in and they found James Joyce with his head in his hands one day, and he's like, Jimmy, what's wrong? And he's like, is it the book? And Joyce was just inconsolable, and he's like, well, how did you do today? How did the writing go? And he was like, I wrote 7 words, and his friend was like, Jimmy, that's great for you in a day. and Joyce responded, yeah, but I don't know what order they go in.
Yeah, it's agonizing.
Maybe conclude with a little Irish story. In the New Yorker, one of my favorite cartoons of all time was a picture of a spaceship, obviously sailing away from the planet Earth in the distance. And the two Martians are looking at each other, and one says to the other, With the exception of that pub crawl in Dublin, I found the whole place rather boring. Thank you all for your questions, and thank you.
Uplift us. I just wanted to mention something because when Kate was talking about commonality, and it prompted me to realize that I did not tell you why the Firehouse Forum was created, and it's important that you know how unique this forum actually is. We don't have, there isn't, as far as I know, anybody else doing anything like this that I know of, where you bring together authors who have written on a similar topic, and they get the opportunity to share their own experience, their own perspective on their books with you, as well as with each other. And authors writers really do live very solitary lives when they're writing. When they're writing, they're struggling and they're alone, and or they come out and they say, "Oh my God," and But I have met so many writers who talk about how solitary that is when they are doing their job. And then they get to come out and they get to talk to you, and it all looks so wonderful and easy and effortless because the book is done, and they can, but it is, it became a way for me to try to bring you women and gentlemen together to talk about what you do in your life. And we are, this is not an easy thing to get this program together. We've decided that we're going to, if we can continue this program, we have to do it with help. And because we are not a nonprofit, we are a barely for-profit business, as I mentioned a little bit in the flyer, but we do want to start a Friends of the Firehouse fund. If you are interested in supporting the Firehouse, you can contact me. We are going to set up a fund. If you are interested, any of you, in volunteering, we're going to have to form a, I just can't do this all by myself anymore. And I love what I'm doing, but, I have the rest of my job at the bookstore too. So if anybody is interested in helping to continue this, please contact me at the bookstore, and it would be great because I'd love to keep doing this. And, I've got a lot of ideas already for new upcoming forums, and I hope that we can do them, but we really can't do it all alone. So the reception is downstairs, and the authors, we probably should let them go down first so they can go down to the table, and then you all can buy books, have some wine.